Alright, I'm going to make this the last video of tonight, but I don't think this is going to be the last video in this series I'm doing. And I'm going to call it Hitting Humans. This is more of a finger press, clavicular fossa, and sternal notch. I think I've got... Clavicular fossa is between your trapezius and your collarbone. There's a little hollow, right? And the sternal notch, if you press in, you'll find the notch. This is actually behind the notch. If you press it and find your Adam's apple, instead of going forward into the Adam's apple, if you press down into the gap, and with my short, thick neck, there's not much of a gap, but in many people, there's a bigger gap, and even in really big, well-built people, there is a gap. If you insert like 2 or 3 fingers and come down, same thing with the clavicular notch, right? I've done that 2 fingers. I do that a lot. And you press and depress like you're trying to go down into the person's chest cavity, into their lungs, or into the center of their chest where the heart is, right? It, aside from producing incredible pain, the body's ability to move begins to be shut down. And it's intensely painful, but I don't even know if it's one of those things that goes to the brain and starts doing stuff to the nervous system and the directions your muscles get. I'm wondering if it's one of those things that just gets into gets to the spine or medulla, and your body has a reaction before your brain even reacts to it. There are neurological things that affect the spine do that to people, right? So I've used that technique outside of a training situation so many times that I think the video would be an hour long. I've had multiple situations where people that don't do martial arts, don't understand martial arts, will talk about how horrible my martial arts are, because they'll see me doing kung fu, like some forms or fluid techniques, or some tai chi or some silat. They'll see me doing this stuff and they'll be like, "It just looks like dancing. It looks so useless, It doesn't look like other martial arts." And I'm like, well, it's very effective. And these are usually big white guys. It's actually every single time it's been a big white guy who has no or minimal to no martial art training, and often they're well built, decently well built, and I'll say something like, "Well, I could drop you 2 fingers," and they're like, "How?" I'm like, "Do I have your permission? What are you talking?" And then I'll just reach over, press, and oftentimes their legs will collapse and they will just drop. Right? I did it once to a guy who, was trying to be the alpha male, and I, was shaking his hand, and he goes, "Oh, you got such small hands. I can't believe anybody has such small hands." And I just held on to him, and I grabbed, went into the left side clavicular fossa, and I just dropped him into the chair he was there, and I just held him. I'm like, "Try to stand up." He's like, "I can't." I'm like, why don't you punch me in the face, He's like, "I can't move." And I'm like, "I'll give you $100 if you can punch me in the face." And he's like, "What's happening?" I'm like, "I paralyzed you. It's just temporary. I think if I hold on long enough and squeeze hard enough, maybe I'll be able to sterilize you," which, I don't know. It's just like, some stuff to say. But I've never had it not work. Okay? Never. I've never had it not work. And another time, I will talk about one incident when this was in my 40s. This is fairly recently. I was working downtown in Columbia, Missouri, at a place called IRI, Integral Resources Incorporated. Kind of a terrible place to work. They were political fundraisers for democratic causes, but they weren't very democratic, and I think some of the ownership, might have been conservatives, but they just liked the money they were making. There was a kid working there named Paul, who's about 6'4", close to it. And he was we were on a break and we were outside. I think it was a summer day. I remember it being sunny. And he was having a discussion with one of our managers, who was another white guy with long ponytail. This guy was a jerk, a D-I-C-K. And Paul, they're both tall, and Paul's taller than him and bigger. And he's just yelling at him and screaming at him. And, you know, I remember reaching up to Paul's trapezius, and I'm like, Paul, calm down. Calm down. He's like, I'm not going to calm down. I'm like, I thought he was going to, you know, try to hit Austin. The other white guy's name was Austin. And I could feel him kind of tense up like he was going to move. And I just did this with my fingers, went past the traps into clavicular fossa, and he's like, ah! And he dropped down to his knees. And I'm like, Paul, I need you to calm down. I need you to stop this arguing in the street. I want to let you go, but if you turn around and come after me, I'm going to do this again. And he was like, he couldn't really speak. He couldn't speak and he couldn't move. And I let him go. I'm like, are we cool? And then by then, Austin had moved away. I mean, sometimes I'm like, maybe I should have let him fight. I should have let him punch Austin in the face because he was a jerk of a supervisor. But Paul's a fairly good kid, and I didn't want him to get in trouble. Right? I felt like I had to, for everybody's benefit, I had to disarm the situation. And, you know, Paul was like, what did you do? I'm like, well, it's kind of like the Vulcan neck pinch. And he's like, he's a Star Trek fan. And he's like, oh, dude, that's so cool. He's literally a guy that if he's standing in front of me, you know, he could maybe like lean his forearm on my head. You know, he's that tall. And, you know, but sometimes I'd be like, he'd be like, can you teach me some of that? I'm like, well, you know, you're not a very patient guy, and this is kung fu. It's kind of different than the other styles. You know, it takes a while to learn. And sometimes he's like, show me something, and I just be like, come after me, do something. And he, you know, he had like some taekwondo background, so he started to move at me, and I'd usually get out of the way and, you know, just make a few controlled hits and get behind him and slowly sidekick the back of his knee and drop him to one knee, and then, you know, like do something like that, right? Is this something that could work in an actual fight and grappling range? I don't know, but all those instances that I used them in were not academic situations. They were situations where there was a non-resisting, non-compliant person, taller, bigger than me, and younger than me, and it worked. And it, like, I just kind of experimented with it after watching Mr. Spock and reading some, you know, martial art magazines and books, and I figured out how to do it in grade school when I was in Catholic school, so I wasn't even in high school at the time, and I just figured out how to do it, right? And it got more refined when I started learning Kung Fu and hardened my fingers and did some of the training. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, there was a guy in his 30s, very fit individual, who was a white belt, and I had I don't know who had more experience. I was fairly new, maybe I'd been there about 6-7 months, and, you know, he's talking about Shu Shidong and all the, you know, how Kung Fu's fake, and I'm like, no, Kung Fu's not fake, and he's like, well, you know, I see all these guys getting beat up. I'm like, you're seeing the fakes, but that doesn't mean everybody is a fake. And he's like, well, what's the difference between Kung Fu and karate? Isn't Kung Fu, like, you know, much worse than karate? And I'm just like, man. So we were both sitting down cross-legged, and I just reached over and put my finger in the clavicular fossa, and I'm like, stand up, and he's like, I can't. I'm like, try to do something. He's like, I can't. I'm like, that's Kung Fu. So, again, it was a non-compliant situation, but not necessarily a high level of violence. I think if you master pressing those from the back, Vulcan neck pinch style, it might be useful in intervening, maybe in bouncing and things like that. And I've heard of bouncers talking about using that, and more like this one. So, finger press. The other finger press I used, again, this was when I used to work downtown at IRI. There was a big young guy, like maybe even 17 or 18, but he's I call him biracial. Some people would call him black, but I'm like, he's got more than African heritage. And he was huge, tall, kind of like football player tall. And I remember he would just yell and scream during breaks. We were stressed out, and I bumped against him once, and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing that for?" And I'm looking at him like, I reach out my hand for a handshake, and he's like, "Oh, okay," And once we shook hands, I had his right hand. I took this thumb and I pressed into large intestine 4, and he's like, "Ah!" And he pulls back, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Shaking your hand." And he was like rubbing his hand, and I think he wanted to punch me. But then he's like, why the hell does my hand hurt? This little guy, this old guy made my hand hurt. So maybe, and now if I wanted to be a real jerk, like after I'd pressed, instead of letting him go, if I'd slid forward into a thumb lock and pressed him down to the ground and delivered a strike, again, these types of techniques may be useful for mid-levels of potential violence. Maybe they're good to, preempt things. But I mean, those nerves and those nerve clusters and nerve sinuses exist. Vital points in the body exist. The collarbone, the eyeball, the testicles, the Adam's apple, the carotid sinus, which when you hit it right, you hit a carotid sinus vagus nerve and the carotid arteries. So, I mean, that could be devastating. The Taiyang point, take the corner of the eyebrow and corner of the eye and draw up till they come together, and you'll find like a little depression. That's a very dangerous place to hit someone. I think, Master Jose Gonzalez told me when he was in high school, he had a argument with someone in the pool hall, and he whacked him with a dragon fist, and that person went unconscious, and they were having trouble reviving him, and he was afraid that he'd killed a guy. Right? So pressure points are real. Many people don't have the skill and experience to use them. Thank everything that I've never had to full force hit someone on a pressure point with full intention and full power. In training, I've accidentally whacked people during techniques with very light blows to certain pressure points, and they've dropped, and I felt really bad, and I've worked extra hard on my control. That's an educational experience. I'm trying to think, can I remember any other incidences of using finger presses? There was an incident in training which I should mention. Just goes to show you how dangerous this is. A student of mine, I was in my 30s, a student of mine and another friend of mine who had been a student of mine, we were trying to film some self-defense techniques, and I had a situation. I said, let's try this technique. You're sitting down and someone comes up behind you to choke you, and the guy doing the choking was younger than me, in his 20s, taller, bigger, but not necessarily solidly built. He was a little flabby, but he had a good shoulder to waist ratio. He wasn't really out of shape, but he was kind of a nerdy guy. And again, we were kind of doing an impromptu, and I forget sometimes that some of these college kids, that I was training, weren't as robust as maybe people I've trained with in various martial arts studios and in the military and so on and so forth. So sometimes I use extra pressure that I shouldn't. And he, brought that hand around, and instantly I reached behind me, and I think that's called Sanjiao 17. Right there, the base of the ear, there's a little sinus, and you try to press inward and sort of towards the back of the head. And I pressed that, and boom, he let go. And then I slid my hands down, and I found stomach 9. And I pressed the thumbs in and threw them over my shoulder from my seated position. And I talked about the technique into the camera, and my friend who was filming was like, he's not moving. And I looked down, and he was laying on his back, his head's facing me, and he had this look on his face with like a slight tremble, and his breathing was like real shallow. And I was like, are you okay? He couldn't talk. And so I remember, massaging his chest, massaging his solar plexus, kind of like cradling his head, massaging the muscles on the back of the neck. And it took a while for him to be able to talk and get moving again. And I was able to sit him up and kind of like massage his back on the paraspinal region and the trapezius. And we didn't do any more filming that day. So not quite a combat situation. It was a training situation. I'm just including it in this, in that you want to be careful with this type of information. Not everybody human body is robust, and I think my reflexes kicked in, and I put in a lot of pressure to the Sanjiao point and to the stomach 9 point, and in a series. And neurologically, just the pain alone, plus all the vital functions covered by those nerves, that's probably something you should not play around with, right? That's probably you should find those points, press a little bit, maybe the person can tap, and then move to the next point, and they can tap to let you indicate. It's not the same as if you're training spontaneous attack and you do a quick parry and thump the guy in the chest with a right cross at 60%, and the person's like, ugh, good shot, right? And a minute later, or 20 seconds later, they're fine. Parts of the body are soft, squishy, and give you access to other parts of the body that are softer and squishier, right? Hitting humans. Again, I'm not claiming to be a great master. I'm just saying that sometimes I've had to do things, or sometimes I've done things that probably didn't have to, shouldn't have, but that had consequences. And luckily, I don't think I've hurt anybody super bad with the consequences. You know what? I got to do one on front kicks. Because it's an underrated kick.